What would you do if your neighbor decided your home didn't belong anymore? If a group of people who had no legal right over your land suddenly tried to control every inch of it, just because they didn't like the way it looked? I never thought much about homeowners associations. They were something other people dealt with, the type of people who cared about matching mailboxes, lawn symmetry, and backyard gazebos. My farm had nothing to do with any of that. It had existed long before Oak Ridge Estates, and its perfectly manicured streets even broke ground. My grandfather bought these 6 acres decades ago, and when he passed, he left them to me. I built something beautiful here, a small but thriving farm, a place where the air smelled like fresh soil, where the fireflies danced at dusk, and where life moved at its own, peaceful rhythm. For years, I lived quietly on my land, growing the best tomatoes you'd ever taste, tending to my 15 chickens, and watching my 2 goats lazily trim the grass. My neighbors from the nearby town would stop by for fresh eggs, and local families would visit my little roadside produce stand. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And then, 3 years ago, the developers came. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. The Oak Ridge Estates development had nothing to do with me. Their high-end houses with their uniform hedges and luxury sedans were across the road, separated from my farm by an old wooden fence and a line of trees. I wasn't part of their HOA. I wasn't under their rules. But all of that changed the day Karen Whitfield moved in. She introduced herself with a complaint. No hello, no neighborly handshake, just a sharp, condescending tone as she stood at the edge of my property, her arms crossed over an expensive blouse that probably cost more than my entire feed bill. "Is that your rooster making that awful racket at 5 in the morning?" she demanded. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to be polite. "That's Harold. He's just doing his job. Farm animals make noise sometimes, that's country living." Karen's lips pinched together like she'd just tasted something sour. "This isn't the country anymore," she snapped. "This is Oak Ridge Estates. And we have standards." I should have known then. I should have seen the warning signs. But I thought she was just another city transplant who didn't understand how things worked out here. I thought she'd adjust. Instead, she declared war. The first letter arrived in my mailbox a week later, official-looking paper with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA logo printed across the top. A list of violations against my property. Too many chickens. Improper fencing. Unsightly gardening equipment. It ended with a thinly veiled threat, fines if I didn't comply. The problem? I wasn't part of their HOA. They had no jurisdiction over my land. But that didn't stop Karen from trying. The letters started coming weekly after that. Then came the complaints to the city. She claimed my compost pile was ruining her backyard experience. She took photos of my property from the street, highlighting anything she deemed unacceptable: stray feathers from my chickens, a wheelbarrow left near the fence, the smell of fresh soil after a rain. Slowly, the other residents started turning against me. People who used to wave when they drove past now looked the other way. Mrs. Ramirez, who had been buying eggs from me for years, suddenly stopped coming by. The only person who still spoke to me was Lisa Carter, one of the few Oak Ridge homeowners who hadn't completely fallen under Karen's spell. One evening, as she walked her dog past my place, she leaned against my fence and sighed. "Don't take it personally," she said. "Karen's been showing pictures of your farm at HOA meetings, calling it a health hazard. Some people believe her. Others just don't want to fight." I frowned. Can she really do anything? My property isn't even part of Oak Ridge Estates. Lisa hesitated. Karen's husband has friends on the county zoning board. She's been talking about getting the boundaries redrawn. I didn't sleep well that night. Or many nights after that. Because if Karen got her way, my farm, my entire life, would be at risk. And I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to make it happen. 2 weeks. That was all the time I was gone. Just 14 days away from my farm, my home, to take care of my mother after her latest round of treatments. I had worried about leaving, but there was no choice. She needed me. So, I did what any responsible farm owner would do. I prepared. Before I left, I asked Tony Delgado, my closest friend and the only person I trusted in this town, to check on my animals. I set up security cameras facing the property line, the barn, and my chicken coop. I even called the county sheriff's office, letting them know I'd be away and had concerns about possible trespassing. They told me they'd keep an eye out. And yet, the moment I turned onto my road, I knew something was wrong. The sky wasn't clear blue like it should have been, it was a dull, ashy gray, as if someone had smeared charcoal across the horizon. Then came the smell. A thick, acrid stench that clung to the air, worse than any bonfire or barbecue. The scent of something unnatural. Something destroyed. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas pedal, my old truck rattling as I sped toward home. But when I crested the last hill and my farm came into view, my stomach twisted into knots so tight I couldn't breathe. It was gone. The barn, the one I'd repaired with my own hands, stood as nothing more than a skeletal frame of blackened beams. The chicken coop, where my hens had laid warm eggs every morning, was now a pile of collapsed ash. My vegetable garden, the one I had nurtured for years, was nothing but scorched earth, the once green rows of crops reduced to smudges of soot. The wooden fence that had marked the boundary of my land had been devoured by flames, and even the soil itself looked dead, robbed of its life by the heat of the fire. I barely noticed my truck skidding to a stop as I threw the door open and stumbled out, running toward the ruins, my boots kicking up dust and bits of charred debris. Henrietta. Cluck. Ruby. My voice cracked as I called out the names of my chickens, my throat burning from smoke and grief. Silence answered me. The farm was empty, void of the sounds that had once made it feel alive. No soft clucking, no bleating from my goats, just the distant hum of wine through the dead grass. Then I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. A pristine white SUV pulled into my driveway, so clean it was as if it had never once encountered a speck of dirt. And stepping out of the driver's seat, wearing spotless white pants and a designer blouse, was Karen Whitfield. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look horrified. If anything, there was something satisfied in the way she looked around, like a queen surveying her conquered kingdom. Then she smiled. "Well," she said, clasping her hands together. "Looks like the farm problem took care of itself." I couldn't speak. My body shook with rage, with grief, with the sheer inability to process what was happening. I turned, and that was when I saw Rick Thompson, the HOA president, stepping out of another car, a thick leather folder tucked under his arm. He adjusted his tie, his expression neutral, businesslike, as if this was just another meeting. "We understand this is difficult for you," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "But while you were away, we held an emergency HOA meeting regarding the ongoing issue your property was creating for the community." I barely managed to find my voice. "Ongoing issue?" I choked. "This is my farm. My home. What the hell did you do?" Karen let out a dramatic sigh, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You had plenty of warnings. Multiple notices about your violations." I clenched my fists. "I am not in your HOA." Rick gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind you'd give a child who didn't understand the rules of a game they had already lost. "Actually, that changed last month. The county officially rezoned your land into Oak Ridge Estates." I froze. Karen's grin widened. "Which means," she said, "you're subject to our rules now. And as you can see, your property did not meet community standards." A sick feeling crawled up my spine. "So you burned it down?" My voice was barely a whisper, the words thick with disbelief. You killed my animals. Destroyed everything I built. Rick cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We didn't burn anything. We simply hired a contractor to remove the unsanctioned structures, your chicken coop, compost piles, non-approved fencing. If things got out of hand, well, the dry conditions this time of year may have contributed to the spread. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. They were standing in the ashes of my life, pretending this was just a routine neighborhood cleanup. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them understand what they had done. But then, something caught my eye. A glint of metal, barely visible through the soot. My property marker, the one that had been placed by the county when I inherited the land. It was still there, untouched, right where it had always been. A tiny flicker of something ignited in my chest. Not just grief. Not just anger. Hope. I turned back to Karen and Rick, my voice suddenly calm. I think you should leave now. Karen laughed. Or what? You'll sick your chickens on us. Oh, wait, she smirked. You can't. Something inside me snapped. I stood up straight, locked eyes with her, and spoke with the kind of certainty that made even the most arrogant people hesitate. You've made a huge mistake, Karen. I took a slow step forward, watching as, for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her perfect, smug face. And you're going to regret it. Rick put a hand on her arm, steering her back toward the car. We'll give you some time to process this, he said. But just so you know, you have 30 days to bring the rest of your property into compliance. The rule book is in your mailbox. I didn't watch them leave. I didn't look at the neighbors gathering near the road, whispering among themselves. I only stared at that property marker, the tiny glint of truth beneath the wreckage. They thought they had won. But something wasn't adding up. And I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. I didn't sleep that night. The stench of smoke still clung to my clothes, the acrid reminder of what had been taken from me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames licking at my barn, the ghostly remains of my garden, the empty space where my chickens should have been. But beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A simmering fire of my own. They thought they had won. They thought they could destroy everything I built and walk away unscathed. But they underestimated me. At dawn, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork. County zoning records, my property deeds, old tax assessments, every document I could get my hands on. I traced the boundary lines with my finger, comparing them to the new map Rick had smugly presented at my burned farm. Something felt off. I needed proof. I called the county recorder's office the moment they opened. A woman named Debbie Collins answered, her voice bright and polite. Hi, I need confirmation about a zoning change, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Specifically for a property on County Road 16. There was a pause as she pulled up the records. Oh, yes. That was processed just last month, she said. But it was an unusual one. The county rarely approves changes that affect individual private properties. My stomach tightened. Can you send me the official maps? Of course. Give me just a second. Minutes later, my printer hummed to life, spitting out the real zoning maps. My heart pounded as I examined them. The eastern half of my property, the part where my barn, my chicken coop, and my garden had stood, was still completely outside of Oak Ridge Estate's jurisdiction. The HOA had no legal right to touch it. I exhaled, my pulse racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was fraud. I grabbed my phone and called my cousin, Sarah Lawson, a no-nonsense attorney who didn't back down from a fight. The moment she heard what happened, she was in her car, driving over with a briefcase full of legal ammunition. Let me get this straight, Sarah said, flipping through the documents I laid out in front of her. They claimed your farm was rezoned, burned down the part that was never actually included, and then handed you a rulebook as if you were the one who needed to follow their laws? Pretty much. She let out a low whistle. That's criminal destruction of property at best. And if we can prove they knew they were outside their jurisdiction? That's malicious intent. I clenched my fists. I need more proof. Sarah tapped the edge of the zoning map. Then let's get it. That afternoon, I drove to the county zoning office, armed with every piece of evidence I had. Sarah walked in beside me, her heels clicking against the tile floor. We requested every record related to my property's rezoning. What we found made my blood run cold. Buried in the paperwork was a hand-drawn amendment to the zoning map, marked with Karen Whitfield's initials. It wasn't an official document. It was a forgery. And worse? The county official who approved it had resigned just days after signing off on it. Karen pulled strings to make this happen, Sarah muttered, scanning the page. She didn't just want to control your farm, she wanted it gone. It wasn't just about HOA rules. It was never about the chickens, the compost, or the so-called unsightly view. Karen had used her connections to rezone my land, knowing full well it was illegal. But why? I got my answer that evening. Lisa Carter knocked on my door, looking pale and nervous. "I need to show you something," she said, holding up her phone. "You're not the only one Karen's been targeting." She pulled up a private HOA email thread and scrolled through message after message. Karen had been bullying other residents too, weaponizing the HOA against anyone who didn't fall in line. She had fined homeowners for minor violations, blackmailed Lisa into silence by threatening to revoke her community privileges, and even used HOA funds for personal luxuries. "She's been siphoning money for years," Lisa whispered. "Lavish vacations, home renovations, she's been making us pay for it all." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was a crook. And then Lisa showed me the final email, the one that made everything click into place. It was a forwarded message from a real estate developer, thanking Karen for her efforts in securing additional land for Oak Ridge Estate's future expansion. Attached was a blueprint, a planned development that included my farm. "She's been trying to drive you out for months," Lisa said. "She never wanted your chickens gone, she wanted your land." Rage boiled in my chest. She hadn't just burned down my farm out of spite. She had done it to clear the land for profit. Sarah exhaled beside me. This just went from a lawsuit to a full-blown criminal case. But before I could process it all, my phone buzzed. It was Mark Benson, one of the few neighbors who had kept his distance from the HOA drama. "I have security footage you need to see," he said. His voice was tense. "It's about the fire." My heart pounded. "What did you find?" Mark hesitated, then said, "Karen was there. The morning of the fire. With a gas can." The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the table. "Send me everything." Minutes later, I watched the footage, my hands shaking. Karen's SUV pulling up near my property. Karen stepping out. Carrying a red gas canister. Walking toward my barn. And then, I saw it. The flicker of a match. My chest tightened. It wasn't just illegal rezoning. It wasn't just a corrupt HOA. Karen Whitfield had set my farm on fire with her own hands. I looked at Sarah. "We have everything we need." She nodded. "Then let's burn her entire world to the ground." The moment I had the footage in my hands, I knew this wasn't just about lawsuits anymore. This was arson. This was criminal. And Karen Whitfield was about to face the full weight of the law. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office, gripping the USB drive like a weapon. Sheriff Bill Harper was an old-school lawman, not one to get involved in HOA disputes, but the second he saw the footage, his jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply through his nose. "This isn't just a fire," he muttered. "She poured accelerant. That means she didn't just want your farm gone, she wanted it burned fast." I swallowed hard. "And she nearly got away with it." He nodded, pushing back his chair. "Not anymore." By sunset, Karen Whitfield's perfect world began to unravel. The police got a search warrant for her home and vehicle, looking for any remaining evidence. I watched from across the street as squad cars pulled up to her pristine driveway, officers stepping out with purpose. Karen stormed outside, already yelling before they even reached her porch. "This is harassment," she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm an HOA board member. You can't just barge into my house." Sheriff Harper barely looked at her as he handed over the warrant. "Ma'am, we have video evidence of you committing arson. We're here to collect further proof." The color drained from her face. She faltered, her lips parting like she was about to argue, but she saw the officers already moving toward her garage. Her hands clenched into fists, her entire body stiff with fury. "This is outrageous," she spat, turning toward Rick Thompson, who had come running over from next door, his face already sweaty with panic. "Rick, do something." Rick, to his credit, tried. "Karen, we should." But then the officers rolled out 2 empty red gas cans from her garage, identical to the one in the video. And just like that, whatever argument she had died on her lips. For the first time, Karen Whitfield was speechless. I barely noticed the murmur spreading through the neighborhood, the gathering crowd of homeowners watching as the woman who had ruled over them with an iron fist was now helpless. And then came the final blow. One of the officers emerged holding a black leather binder, the HOA's financial records. I exchanged a look with Lisa Carter, who had been standing beside me, arms crossed. "That's what I was hoping they'd find," she murmured. The sheriff flipped through the binder, shaking his head. "Jesus," he muttered. "She's been siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from HOA funds for personal use." Lisa smirked. "Hope that new kitchen remodel was worth it." That was it. The HOA board turned on her instantly. Even Rick, who had been her staunchest ally, backed away like she was contagious. "This was all her," he blurted. "I just followed what she told me to do." Karen spun on him, eyes wild. "You spineless coward." And that's when Sheriff Harper nodded to his deputies. "Karen Whitfield, you're under arrest for arson, destruction of property, fraud, and embezzlement." The moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, something in me finally released. Karen fought every step of the way. "I was protecting this community," she screamed as they dragged her toward the squad car. "Do you know who I am? This is a mistake. You can't do this to me." The doors slammed shut. The sirens flared to life. And just like that, Karen Whitfield was gone. The neighborhood was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, voices began murmuring, whispers of "Did she really do it?" and "How did we not see this coming?" Lisa turned to me, exhaling. She really thought she was untouchable. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. Not anymore. The fallout came fast. The HOA board collapsed within a week, its remaining members resigning one by one to avoid being dragged down with Karen. Lawsuits piled up, not just from me, but from homeowners who realized they'd been scammed for years. And then came the settlement. Karen had been so sure of her power that she'd never expected to fall. With her conviction looming, the HOA's insurance company stepped in, desperate to clean up the mess she left behind. Sarah sat across from me at the negotiation table, flipping through the paperwork with a satisfied smirk. "They're offering 6 times what they originally tried to settle for." I stared at the number. It was enough to rebuild everything. Enough to make sure my land would never, ever fall under HOA control. I signed the papers without hesitation. 2 weeks later, I stood at my farm, the place Karen had tried to erase, and watched as volunteers arrived, ready to help rebuild. Neighbors who had once looked away now came with tools, seeds, and supplies. Even Rick Thompson showed up. He approached hesitantly, hands stuffed in his pockets. "For what it's worth," he muttered, "I didn't think it would go this far." I let the silence stretch before answering. "You didn't stop her?" He nodded, looking down. "No. I didn't." Then, without another word, he handed me a bag of nails for rebuilding the chicken coop and walked away. Lisa grinned as she handed me a tray of vegetable seedlings. "Ready to start over?" I looked out over my land, not dead, not gone, but waiting to be reborn. I nodded. "Let's do it." 6 months after Karen Whitfield was led away in handcuffs, my farm stood once more, not just rebuilt, but thriving. Where there had once been only scorched earth, green life had returned. The new chicken coop was bigger and sturdier, designed with fireproof materials. The barn had been rebuilt with stronger wood, standing tall against the horizon. Rows of vegetables stretched across the land, healthier than ever, and my new greenhouse meant I could grow crops year-round. The first time I stepped inside it, inhaling the scent of fresh soil and young plants, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. But the biggest surprise wasn't the farm itself, it was the people. The very neighbors who had once turned their backs on me showed up to help rebuild. Some brought tools, others donated supplies, and many simply offered their time, ready to undo the damage Karen had caused. Even people from Oak Ridge Estates, the same community that had nearly destroyed me, lined up at my new produce stand, eager to support the farm they had once considered an eyesore. Lisa Carter, now the newly elected president of the HOA, worked with me to establish a neighborhood farmers market in the park. Instead of tearing the community apart, my battle with Karen had changed it. As for Karen, she had no grand redemption arc. She served her time, sold her house at a loss, and left town without a word. The young family who moved in after her brought their kids to my gardening classes. They loved the farm. They loved the land she had tried so hard to destroy. In the end, she lost everything, not just her position of power, but the future she had tried to steal from me. 1 year after the fire, I stood at the edge of my property and watched the sun rise over my land, my home, my legacy. The farm was stronger than ever. And I had proven one thing beyond a doubt: greed and control may win battles, but they never win the war. I turned to the camera crew that had returned to document my story and smiled. If I learned anything from this, it's that good fences and property surveys make good neighbors. Then I looked at the bustling farmers market, the neighbors working together, the children laughing as they chased my chickens, and added, but sometimes, the right people can turn even the worst enemies into allies. So tell me, have you ever been at war with an HOA? Or had a neighbor like Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.